have seen the movie Inside Out? Oh wow, that is way fewer than I thought. Okay, the children's movie, Never Getting Bells, you saw it? Okay, we've got some hands back here, great. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is your official mild spoiler warning, so if you want to leave, we'll have an empty chair. Inside Out, as most of you know, is an animated movie about the emotions running around an 11-year-old girl's brain. And these emotions are quite literally running around. Each emotion is personified as its own character, complete with funky hairstyles and cute costumes. Joy, anger, fear, disgust, and sadness. It's actually kind of a brilliant concept to help kids and adults better visualize and understand their feelings. The premise of the movie is that this 11-year-old girl, Riley, has been forced to move across the country with her family and is struggling to process the grief of that experience. She exiles both joy and sadness to the corners of her brain and leaves fear, anger, and disgust in control, which means she begins lashing out at her family and making rash decisions. Throughout the movie, Joy is frustrated with sadness, feeling like sadness ruins everything and has no purpose. It seems as though joy is a good and helpful emotion, while sadness is a bad and useless one. Yet there's this moment towards the end of the movie that changes all of that. Riley, instead of lashing out in anger or secluding herself, finally breaks down sobbing. And her parents finally realize what she is feeling and what she needs. They hug Riley and comfort her, and they're able to tell Riley that she's not alone. They, too, are feeling sad and miss their old home. Suddenly we realize sadness is not a bad or a useless emotion. Sadness serves a purpose. It allows us to communicate with others when we are struggling and when we need help. I think about this scene pretty often for it being a children's movie, because quite often I have conversations with people who tell me they are sad, but they don't want to cry or ask for help or let others know they are struggling. And I always want to say, remember sadness? Remember that she isn't a bad or a useless character, but actually she has an important purpose. This is what I think of when I read our story for today. In today's story, we are walking with Jesus and his disciples between towns, which seems to be where every story in the Gospels starts. Suddenly we hear a voice crying out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now this phrase, "have mercy on me," isn't one we use very often outside of religious contexts, so we might better translate this phrase, "take pity on me," or simply, "help me." This man is crying out from the side of the road, "Jesus, help me." The disciples and the crowds around Jesus all try to silence him. "Shh," they say, "don't bother him." Or, "those feelings are too big for this space. Try to make them smaller." Or, "be quiet, there are other more important people for Jesus to take care of." Do any of those voices sound familiar? These are messages we've internalized, whether from our society or our families or even just our own insecurities. Shh. Don't bother anyone. Take up less space. We shush our sadness as if it is bad or useless or even embarrassing. But this man named Bartimaeus, will not be silenced. Instead, he shouts even louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Help me." Jesus, hearing Bartimaeus' cries, stops walking, looks around, can't find Bartimaeus in the crowd, so he asks his disciples, "Call him here, bring him to me." We're reminded in this moment that Bartimaeus can't see Jesus. He has heard that Jesus is walking this way, he can hear the footsteps and the chatter of the crowd, but because he's blind, he doesn't know where Jesus is, in the midst of the hustle and bustle. So he has to stand at the side of the road, crying out, hoping he's close enough, hoping the right person will hear him. These voices, these strangers, lead him to Jesus, and there Bartimaeus is finally standing in front of someone who might actually be able to help him. And Jesus gently asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" I don't want us to skip over this question because it's important. It's important because often it's a question we forget to ask. Sometimes we see people who are suffering and we assume that we know what they want or need. We jump into action, giving advice, or saying things we think are comforting, like, "God won't give you more than you can handle." We might offer them charity, or ask if they've tried essential oils or a keto diet. But Jesus doesn't assume. He wants to know what it is Bartimaeus actually wants, what he actually needs. And Bartimaeus says, "I want to see." So Jesus, in a moment, gives Bartimaeus the ability to see. Many preachers and commentators think that this is the most important moment in the story. But I disagree. I think the most important moment is when Bartimaeus is crying out, and keeps crying out, despite all the voices that are trying to silence him. He keeps crying out despite the fact that he has been shunned by a society for his blindness, despite the fact that those around him are ignoring him, despite the fact that his needs have been so often treated as unimportant. He keeps crying out because he knows that even if he is ignored or shunned or dismissed, he is worthy of care. He is worthy of asking for help. He deserves to take up space, and he deserves to be heard. And Jesus affirms this. Because Jesus could continue talking to the people in the crowd who were most important, most respected. He could ignore the cries of the beggars, the disabled, the outcasts. But instead, he shushes the most powerful people and turns to the most powerless. And he says, "What can I do to help?" I think this story poses two important questions for us. The first is, are we crying out for help when we need it? Are we allowing ourselves to express our sadness, to admit we have needs, to invite others into the places where we are struggling? Or are we silencing ourselves because we don't want to take up space? Because we think our needs aren't important enough? Because we think our sadness is embarrassing or useless? Second, I think this story invites us to stand in the midst of the crowd around Jesus and to stop there and listen. What voices do we hear crying out around us? Who is crying out for help? Whose voices are being ignored or silenced? I know sometimes pausing and listening to those who are crying out around the world can be overwhelming. We hear the cries of those in our families who are struggling. We hear the cries of those in our community who are unhoused or hungry. We hear the cries of those in our nation who are terrified of what the next month will bring, whether that is waves of hatred or violence or deportation. And we hear the continued cries of those in Gaza, wailing over the losses of their homes, their spouses, their sons and daughters, their babies, crying out for food and water, for safety, for someone to simply stop and pay attention, to care about their suffering. It is overwhelming. Sometimes we freeze up because we don't know what to do or how to help. Sometimes we move along with the crowd because hearing the cries of those in pain is uncomfortable. But in this story, Jesus invites us to stop and listen. He invites us to ask those who are crying out, "What do you want us to do for you?" Interestingly, Jesus asked his disciples this very same question in the paragraph right before our story today. "What do you want me to do for you?" He asked James and John, and these disciples said, "Appoint us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." In other words, James and John asked to be given positions of power right next to Jesus. They want more power, more recognition, more importance. Their concerns are so very different than the concerns of Bartimaeus, who simply wants to see. And we see that Jesus consistently is a whole lot more interested in helping those who are powerless than in helping the powerful gain more power. Because Jesus responds to those disciples by saying, "Do you understand what you're asking for?" And to Bartimaeus he says yes, immediately, without question. Bartimaeus, rejoicing, follows him. We don't see it in the passage of scripture we read today, but if Bartimaeus and the crowd are following Jesus, that means they will follow him to Jerusalem. They will follow him to Jerusalem, where in a few short chapters, in weeks, perhaps even just a few short days, Jesus will be arrested and beaten and crucified. They will follow him not to the joyous celebration of Messiah that they expected, but they will follow him to the horrific suffering of the cross. They will follow him to his death, and to the grief of losing the man who taught them and healed them and gave them so much. So, while Bartimaeus' story is one of healing and of receiving the help he needs, it is not a story that removes all of his suffering. He will suffer the same grief that the rest of Jesus' followers experience. He will suffer the same grief that all of us experience in a world where people are imprisoned and made victims of violence, where people get sick and die. This, understandably, is what often makes us overwhelmed when we hear those who are suffering crying out for help. We think, no matter what I do, the suffering won't end. And to some extent, this is true. We can't take away other people's suffering. We can't miraculously heal them. We can't end wars or genocides or state-sanctioned violence. But we can turn to those who are crying out and ask gently, "What do you want us to do for you?" And we can listen when they tell us. May we ask for help when we need it. And may we ask others how we can help, even if we can't take away their suffering. Because we and they are worthy of care. Amen.